This happened back when I was in high school. It was roughly 2008 or 2009. I don't remember exactly. I can tell you, it was beginning to get colder outside, which means it was probably either spring or fall. And at this time, since I was in high school, I had been dating this girl for about 6 months. We had this thing where I would sneak over to her house at nighttime. It didn't always work out, but when it did, it was pretty fantastic. Well, to get over to her house, I not only had to sneak out of mine, but cross through this small section of forest that led into her neighborhood. It wasn't like the deep woods like you're probably thinking. It was more like a small park or trail that you had to walk about 15 minutes through. I'd say no more than half a mile at best. This would take you right into her neighborhood, and after walking maybe another quarter mile, you'd get right to her house, where I'd sneak in her window, and the next thing you know, we're out of there by 3 a.m. Never to be caught. So this night was pretty much the same as any other. I waited for my parents to go to bed, although my dad was a night owl, and he usually crashed out around midnight or 1 in the morning. So finally, after he went to bed, I waited for him to start snoring. I quickly got myself ready and jumped out my window, making sure to lock my door. Luckily for me, we lived in a 1-story house, so removing my screen and climbing out my window unnoticed was very easy for me to do. What's nice is my parents had no idea at the time. I would make my way down the street, past our neighborhood, into the trail section that would lead across to her neighborhood. Our high school also sits between here as well, so this trail through this wooded area is also a nice shortcut instead of going all the way around our school. She was already texting me, wanting to know when I was going to be there. I had a good feeling about this night. Things were going to get hot and heavy pretty quickly, as they usually did. So I was trying my best to hurry up. As I entered the trail though, I just felt something was off, and I couldn't quite place what it was. Sure, at 16 years of age, I was pretty naive and ignorant to the world around me. But even my senses at that age could tell there was something just not right. Although, I quickly pushed those feelings aside and pursued my hormonal destiny. I figured that if I picked up the pace, it would get me there a little faster, which I did. And after getting to about the halfway point in the trail, it kind of forks off. You could take the right way of the path, which will lead you out towards the school. There's also other trails through there that lead around, and from what I remember, I believe there are other homeless people that live around here, or at least have camps set around here by the river. I don't go that way. I usually just keep going straight, which cuts through the entire city area. So I get past the fork, and now I get the impression that I'm being followed. Uh-oh. Well, I wouldn't say I was in danger at all. It was definitely unnerving to be followed. My first thought was that my father had snuck out behind me and he was following me to see where I was going. So I would stop in my tracks and look behind me and kind of scout around. It didn't appear that nobody else was here. I didn't hear anybody in the trees. I saw nobody else on the trail around me, behind or in front of me. Maybe it's just my own paranoia of getting caught. So I went back on my way and tried to go as quick as I could, keeping my feet up. But the feelings became more and more intense, and it would grow and grow, the same way a stomach pain gradually starts and intensifies in pain. By the end of the trail, I was really starting to feel freaked out. Now, luckily I had made it through the trail, all the way to the end, but the feeling never left. However, as I made my way into the neighborhood, and eventually to my girlfriend's house, which was sweet, sweet victory, the feelings subsided, and I ignored them for the time being. So, I'll kind of skip this next part, where you can assume what happened once I was able to successfully get into my girlfriend's bedroom from her window. It's what teenagers usually do when they're alone at nighttime, and yeah. So let's fast forward till about 2:45 a.m., when I'm lying there with my girlfriend, and she's like, "It's late, you need to get back home before you get caught." So I quickly got my clothes back on, and I exited out her window. Luckily, her parents never noticed, and after kissing her goodbye, I made my way back. Now, at this point, I had completely forgotten all about my little paranoia episode from earlier. In fact, I was so fueled with confidence after what had just happened when I made my way back on the trail. I was kind of blindsided by the increasing feeling that would have started, because as soon as I stepped foot back on the trail to head back to my house is when the feelings came back immediately. And then I remembered everything. Not that I ever forgot, but it was a rude reminder. So trying to shake off the feelings, I figured I would just try and maybe do a quick jog through this area. It would only take me about 7 or 8 minutes to reach the other side, back to my own neighborhood, where I would be completely safe and I can make it back into my window. Easy, right? So off I went. I reached about the halfway point when I can now hear something audibly moving in the brush beside me. And not just the brush, but the trees, and I could hear that someone was rustling around. That's when I stopped, pulled out my flashlight, and shined it around, expecting to see somebody hiding. I was worried I was about to be jumped, mugged, beaten, stabbed. Something. Who knows what kind of crazed drug addicts are out here? I didn't know, but I was not about to be a 16-year-old victim. As I'm shining my flashlight around, quite frantically, I noticed something else. The entire night had gone silent. No crickets, no sound. I don't even think there was wind. It was completely dead silent, which was incredibly eerie. After everything went quiet, more rustling, and then out steps this thing, or what I thought was a person maybe in a costume, out onto the trail no more than 10 feet away from me. This was exactly as I'm going to describe it to you. Have you ever heard of a satyr? They're like half man, half goat. They're supposed to be mythological, but that's what this person or thing was. It had the body and figure of a man, in which it stood on 2 legs, had a very masculine build, but the head was that of a goat, and not like a billy goat or something, but a mean, angry, demonic-looking goat. Long horns, more like a ram, wrapping around its head, and its eyes glowed this kind of embery, fiery light that emanated. It towered over me. I'm not short, but I'm also not really tall. I'm about 6 foot, 5'11". This thing was easily 2 feet taller than me, if not more. I mean, it was a massive thing. And I quickly dismissed the idea that this was anyone in a Halloween costume, judging by how realistic this was. The next portion of the story is kind of a blur because all I remember is just turning around and sprinting as fast as I possibly could all the way back to my neighborhood and all the way back to my window. In fact, I must have been so terrified I was reckless and noisy, because when I climbed in my window, I must have been making so much noise to get in that my father began banging at my door, wondering what on earth I'm doing. So after climbing in, I nearly fell in my room, ran up to unlock the door, and he opens it, and he's pissed. He asked me what I was doing. I don't remember what I told him on the spot, but I think I made something up. Luckily, I think he was too tired to put 2 and 2 together of what I did, so he just told me to go back to bed and stop making a ruckus. That's not what he said verbatim, but that's the nice way of putting what he told me. So yeah, that's my story. I wanted to know your opinion. Did I see a satyr? Did I see a Goatman? Did I see a minotaur? What was it that I saw that night? The only other thing that I'll add to this is that after this night, I would continue to sneak to my girlfriend's house for the following school year, but every time, I avoided that trail and went the long way around, not risking experiencing that again. Her and I would break up the following spring, and so I would stop these nightly trips. Thank you for reading. My sighting happened roughly 8 years ago now. I was 16 at the time and living in my house with my parents. It was kind of sitting on an old farm that sat high up on a hill, surrounded by a lot of wilderness. One night, it was pretty late, around midnight or so, and my dog was extra whiny, so I decided to take him out for his nightly business trip. Like I said, the farm has some pretty thick brush and wilderness surrounding it, which is why it sits where it does. The location isn't very desirable, other than its wonderful view from atop the hill. Anyway, we walk out of the small doorframe entrance into our backyard, and there's a straight shot to the road right in front of us, maybe 100 or so feet away, give or take a few feet, with some small lighting that we had made surrounding a small dirt path. I usually just let my dog run around without a leash. He's good at ignoring passerbyers and doesn't really ever go much into the brush to do his business. Of course, kind of being up here, we don't really have that many passerbyers to begin with. So, right as I'm about to call him back inside for bed, after doing his business, I hear the snapping of brush, disturbing from down below in the area next to our house. That's odd. Nobody has been around here for a while. There are no trails for anybody to walk, and the only wildlife we really have around here is deer and raccoons. But it sounded like the weight was heavy, like from somebody who weighs more than 200 pounds. That means there's somebody around, and you can probably guess that this person wasn't probably showing up this late to come say hi. And I could barely see the outline of something big from where I was standing at the time. So, safe to say, whatever made this noise could have come from this, and it probably couldn't see me where I was standing. And it's also important to note that my dog did not make a peep, which he usually barks at things. I quickly look around and hear yet another growl, roar, or snarl coming from behind the house. This is where the previous sounds had come from, but it sounded like there were more of them. Now I'm getting a little spooked. I've never heard anything like this before, and I'm kind of freaked out. Quickly, I open the door to go back inside, and immediately, the noises start again, but begin getting more aggressive now. My dog comes running from the back of the house with his tail tucked between his legs, and a look on his face that only a concerned animal could give you. I tried to get my dog's attention, but he wouldn't look at me. Instead, he was looking at the window to our house, which is where the sound was coming from. As I approached him to get a better look at what was going on outside, I can finally see something big and dark. I couldn't really tell because it was so dark, but the distance of the light, I could tell it was a figure standing on two legs. Very large body. Maybe bigger than a bear, I don't know. And I hear it start to growl, which is what scared my dog and me in the first place. By this time, I'm petrified, and I'm thinking a way of how I can make it out alive in this situation. Whatever was growling at us from the outside had been watching us. It's like it was waiting for me to take a turn and maybe turn off the lights. It knew we were now inside. It's like I could sense it was thinking, watching us. Now, what I'm about to tell you is not urban legend, nor is it another Bigfoot story. This happened in central Illinois. What I saw outside wasn't a man or a goat. This figure was incredibly large, tall, and completely black. Long gangly arms and legs. I can tell this wasn't human. This had to have been a Goatman, judging from the silhouette. I've heard stories about this creature before from urban legends. I've even read about it here or there on the internet, but I all thought it was fake creepypasta, based off of urban legends and ghost stories. As you can see though, this wasn't a Bigfoot or anything else. It couldn't have been. This was something different, which has me thinking that maybe those urban legends come from somewhere. It kind of snarled and turned around into the trees behind us, but I could still feel it watching us, like it was toying with us. Not only that, but there were other growls and noises coming from within the forest. It sounded much more animalistic than what came from this creature. This meant there were more of them. I hope I won't get flamed for this. I would never make something like this up. And if you think so, then keep it to yourself because, at the end of the day, people will believe what they want. Some of you out there might even know what I'm talking about. Be surprised that somebody else on the internet knows about it too. I know what I just said might be hard to believe and maybe even impossible, but please keep an open mind. This is a real encounter I went through and I still think about it a lot to this day. Got a possible Goatman sighting the other night. It wasn't a dog and it certainly wasn't a farm animal. It wasn't a bear or any other animal I've ever seen. I don't know what to make of it. I'm 63 years old, retired. I worked as an options floor trader on the CBOT for 30 years. So I've been around one hell of a lot of strange things in my life. Most people would have never experienced them and surely dismiss as urban legend or myth if somebody like me were to tell them. I have lived in many cities during my lifetime, so I've witnessed some strange things. So anyway, back before I was retired, I was driving back to work at around 8 p.m., getting some Chinese food for dinner. It's almost an hour commute one way, working that schedule. So, needless to say, you get used to being totally exhausted at the end of each day. When I was roughly 2 miles from home, I was stopped at a red light and noticed something walking around on the side of the street. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I got closer, idling, I noticed that this was no animal or bear. I looked around quickly to see if anybody else was seeing this, and it was just me. And it stood there, staring, with these icy, piercing yellow eyes. They kind of seemed to glow in the dark. I had seen big, long horns sticking at the top of its head, features like matted fur, covering most of its body, like a darn bear, except for some patches of dry skin on the lower legs and lower stomach, like its flesh was dark and exposed. I couldn't figure out why nobody else was seeing this thing but me, so I start panicking, fumbling around and trying to grab my phone to get a picture of it, and the darn thing lunges at my door. I drop my phone, and I can remember distinctly the sounds of sharp claws scratching at my car, nearly shattering my window as it jumps over, hits the pavement, and begins running. Panic-stricken and startled, I floor it, racing out of there. And this thing comes barreling towards my vehicle and then just disappears. Can you please help me identify what sort of being this is? I'm back on this website now. I remembered I had wanted to submit my story after watching some videos. I can't believe how many people are seeing this. My parents built a brand new house back in 1995. It even featured an above-ground pool in the backyard. One night, my brothers and I were swimming at night. It was around dusk, when one of them said they could see something coming over the fence. Immediately, we dove under the water, but stayed close to the side so we could see what's coming. They flipped on their stomachs to look into the woods while keeping their heads just out of water. It was getting dark, so we only saw it for about 3 seconds. One of us yelled, "What is that?" before it ran back into the woods. It was on 2 legs and had a very hairy, bear-like body, and ran upright, almost like an Olympic runner would, completely covered in hair from head to toe, except for its head, which looked kind of like a large goat or a cow or something. The eyes were the most disturbing thing about it. I looked right into its eyes, with its ears perked back, and continued running again. My older brother said the same thing, although there's no way we could have caught up to it, even if we had wanted to. Although this thing wasn't very big. It was shorter than we were, maybe 4.5 feet tall. I would say at most probably no more than 200 pounds, and it kind of loped weird, while kind of shaking its body. It was almost like having a seizure as it ran. Although that wasn't the only experience we had. There were other times here in our neighborhood at night, we would hear growling and snarling, and biting and heaving, all sorts of strange sounds from our backyard. Now, I take this with a grain of salt, but my brothers have claimed that they've seen it up close, what they call a Goatman, which I think is preposterous. But this is their words, not mine. Based off our experience, Goatman appears to be very territorial of the woods, especially around my house. So who knows? It might have an entire family living in the forest behind my house. I remember when I was a kid riding bikes at dusk with friends in the neighborhood, and these things were always on the edge of your peripheral vision. But when you turn to look, they were gone, or hiding somewhere in the bushes or trees staring at us with their large green goat eyes. We've seen them several times there, standing there in our backyard at night, watching us while we barbecued, watching TV, playing games, etc. They never did anything but watch. Now, being young, I didn't notice these, but this is kind of quoted from my older brothers. They would even tell me that while I was at school, daytime sightings were even worse. And my brother remembers looking through at it through the window one time while eating dinner. I never saw these again, but again, my brothers did. He even went on to say that every time these things are around, everything just feels strange. Even when you don't see them, you could feel them watching us or waiting for something to happen. Just standing there, in the corner of your eye in the shadows, just beyond the reach of light, watching you intently in silence with their features. Their glowing goat eyes would always watch us, apparently. Who knows? Maybe we really aren't alone, and maybe my brothers aren't full of it. Hello. I have a story that is about my wife and I. We were both there on August 16th, 2018, at night around 10 p.m. in the Adirondacks in New York State. She stopped to pee because we were going to our cabin from Long Lake. She gets out of the truck, walked off towards the woods quite a ways, but not so far so she could still see me while I changed the music on my phone. It was dark, but I had a bright light. She said there were lights coming down from what looked like a trail behind her, maybe 100 meters high up. And then, they hit the treetop height. It started dropping fast down behind her, and all of a sudden, she looks up to see this thing, what she described as a satyr or goat-looking kind of man, running towards her, and she starts screaming. She runs all the way back to me, and I ask her, "What did you see?" Hyperventilating and on the virtual end of panic, she explains this was grayish white all over. Long legs, long arms, a large head, and really long fingers. When she turned and ran, she said it was rustling behind her, following her, until it just dropped off. That's when she was yelling for me to go, 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 floor the truck. This all happened over the course of about 20 seconds. We got out of there. She has never seen anything so scary before, and I believe her. She was genuinely terrified, pale, sweaty. I know my wife. She wouldn't just see a bear or a coyote or a wolf and think this. This was not a mistaken identity. My wife has been camping since she was a little girl. She knows the woods. She knows animals. This was something even I can't explain. I'm in the Air Force, and at this time, in the summer of 1991, I was stationed at a base in Wisconsin. This was in late June. I had just returned from a mission and was into the briefing room early. Usually, we were briefed about things to come, so we were thinking it would be another mission. When we got there, everybody was really quiet, and I thought something had gone wrong with somebody's family until they told us why we were actually there. A local police officer was giving his statement on what he saw that night. The police officer began giving his statement about what he had seen, which was a large cryptid, a term I would come to get very familiar with. This creature wasn't Dogman, it was not Bigfoot, it was not Mothman or any sea monster. He described it as half man, half goat, long horns, red eyes, and long fangs. The officer said that he nearly crashed his car after this thing bolted out into the road in front of him and disappeared into the tree line next door. Now, he was not the only officer to have seen this. There were several other officers on duty that night who've also claimed to see the same creature, all sharing the same similarities. However, even after the briefing, we get to go and talk to him personally, and the guy seems really genuine in his story. Now, I head out on patrols with another airman, and I'm telling him the story as we put together equipment for another mission. He's really surprised and asks me if I'm sure it wasn't a person in a costume. I tell him, no way. What kind of weirdo gets out dressed in the middle of nowhere just for kicks? He tells me he knows somebody who does exactly like what I described. It was this other airman who he said frequently wore big heavy coats no matter how hot it got. It tended to stay up real late at night, walking outside in open fields behind our base specifically. Of course, my friend even confronted him one day about it while out on patrol. But instead of denying any knowledge, the other guy just smiled and said, "You've seen them too." Even as wacko and weird as this guy was, he had apparently seen the same being. So, I'm not really sure what to make of all this, but it's really strange that people in this area have talked about seeing the Goatman on multiple occasions. I still, even now, just about 30 years later, have very minimal knowledge of Goatman. I've heard about Dogman, I've heard about Bigfoot, but Goatman is still very new to me. But I actually stumbled upon your channel one night, just bored, browsing on YouTube, and I saw that you cover a topic not many cover. So I figured I would write up this old story that I can remember pretty fairly, actually, from back when, in the day. Maybe you'll find it useful, maybe you won't. Sorry it's so short though, but again, hopefully you'll find it of use. Feel free to message me if you have any questions. No one knows exactly what it is, but a large goat-like creature had been reportedly spotted in various areas all throughout the state of Wisconsin. So there I was, sitting in my truck taking a break after work, around 7:30 p.m., when all of a sudden, I hear dogs barking and growling. So naturally, I look over to where the dogs are, which is only about 30 feet away from me on the other side of some brush between these two smaller man-made ponds. The ponds were maybe 10-15 feet apart. The dogs had their heads down and were growling at something between the ponds and the reeds. Then, all of a sudden, one dog begins going from barking to going crazy and snarling. He went right through the brush and weeds to the other side. The dog tried following him, but couldn't make it through, so now the other dog was barking like crazy. Out of curiosity, I get out of the car and see what they're barking at. This wasn't like they were barking at a raccoon or something. They were acting like maybe it was a person. I don't know. So I make my way over there real careful like, because you could see something. But then I did see something, and I couldn't tell what it was. I had my knife out and drawn, just in case, but it still seemed kind of hidden. Then, all of a sudden, quick as lightning, this thing burst through the brush onto this path between these two ponds, now only about 40 feet away. At first, it looked like one large black animal, but after it stood up all the way, it was more grayish, with longer hair, and looked exactly like a freak of nature. Its body was reminiscent of a bear when it stands up, but its head was wrong. It looked like a ram or something. Long twisted horns, beating glowing eyes, and sharp jagged teeth. It stood on its hind legs for a second, got a good look at me and sized me up, and I got the scariest look into its eyes that I have ever seen. They were this reddish yellowish green, and it kind of seemed to be grinning at me, showing off its teeth. Whatever this thing was, I wanted nothing to do with it. By this time, another dog had already busted through the brush, wanting to defend his territory or whatever, but when he saw this thing, he turned right around after going one look at this thing, running back through the brush, yelping, as if something had just torn his leg off. And after that, me being alone in an area that I had no idea what this thing was, I hightailed it out of there, faster than you could think. When I got back to my truck, I sat for a little bit, trying to process what all had just happened, and I noticed two sets of tracks, one whatever had come from, and the other set going back through the brush. They were huge track marks with really long strides. This creature definitely wasn't some stray dog or anything like that. I mean, it was huge. That's all I can really say about this incident for now. But if anybody has any info on what this could be, please let me know. Whatever it is, it's still out there, and so are those dogs who seem to have encountered it as well. Hopefully, those dogs are safe. So here's my full account of the Goatman encounter that happened. I was about 12 years old, and this took place in northern Texas. This post has been a long time coming, but for obvious reasons, I've not really talked about it much to anybody. It's one thing to see something you can never unsee once in your life, but when others are involved, it becomes even more difficult to tell them what happened. So, if you are willing to hear my full story, read on. But if not, I understand. What led up to the encounter? So, 2002 to 2003. Me and my friend were spending the night with his family at their rural home in northern Texas. The area we were in was pretty secluded. We felt comfortable letting us stay outside until the early morning hours, without worrying about anybody bothering us. It wasn't a big deal. There literally wasn't another house for miles, so we just hung out next to this small barn-like structure they had on their property. We ended up getting bored of our surroundings and decided that it would be fun to go fishing in one of their ponds, right across the highway from their house. The highway is literally less than 100 yards away from their house. So, we grab our fishing poles and start walking over to the pond. We had only been there once before, but pretty much knew where it was located because of how close it was to the highway. So now that you have some idea of how secluded this place is, let me give you a little perspective. The nearest body of water from location would probably be around 5 miles away, if I had to guess. It wasn't too far away, but at 12 years old, it felt like it. Since we were so tired after spending all day trying to find things to do without getting bored, both of us were ready for bed as soon as we got back home, which was probably roughly at 11:30 p.m. A day or two later, us and our friend had to go back home. His family still wanted to be nice and let him stay the night at our house without asking for anything in return. So he pretty much just followed us around all day, doing whatever we did. So that night, my friend decided that since it was dark out, he wanted to sleep with me on my bedroom floor because of how close I was. Now, I didn't want to sound like a douche by telling him no, it wasn't happening. So I told him, okay, sure. And he ended up falling asleep on my floor, sometime past midnight. Keep in mind that my family was upstairs in bed and I had no pets of any kind. Now here's the encounter. This is going to be a long portion, but if you're going to read the whole story, it of course has to be included. At around 12:30 a.m., I woke up. I heard my front door open and close, and I woke up to see my friend walking into the bedroom with a flashlight. He said something along the lines of, "You need to see this." We both got up off the floor, followed outside, and led to the driveway. Once we got out there, he immediately made me turn around and look behind me towards the barn-like structure that was sitting on top of a hill, roughly 200 yards away from where we were standing. The second he turned off his flashlight, I could see it. It appeared to be a large, bright white figure, but what struck me as odd was that this white figure was like that of a large goat. And I don't mean a large goat, I mean a large goat, meaning 8 to 9 feet tall and walking around like a damn minotaur. So at this point, I'm totally dumbfounded. I don't know how to react, and of course, my friend is having none of it. He saw what we were looking at, and immediately began sprinting towards his truck parked next to our street. Of course, he ran off to his truck, jumped in, and hid, and I ran back in the house. And by now, my parents must be wondering why their front door just opened and closed on its own. So I wake them up and ask them what I should do. They told me go back outside, and I realized my friend was still out there. He was freaking out, having a mental breakdown, hyperventilating, when we both looked back over to the hill. Whatever it was now gone. I don't know what it was, but it freaked us out. So long story short, we ended up back in the house and tried to sleep the rest of the night. So, from what I've been told, which was pretty recently, I guess, something also had attacked my friend's vehicle about a few weeks ago. He called the police, but they wrote it off as a bear attack. Now, whatever this was had torn his tires off his car. I'm not exactly sure what this is. This is right around southern Mississippi, by the way, since he moved over there. Now, my other friends who I talked to have claimed to see white faces staring in their windows at night. I don't know if this is all paranormal, I don't know if we're just seeing strange shapes, but either way, any help would be nice, because all this is very, very weird. Hello to all. For years, I've been interested in what people call Goatman. The creature has taken many forms for me. My encounter begins when I was just 13 years old. It was summer, and it was just another usual night for me. This meant nothing but the usual teenage mischief. I had my friends over. We were about to break into our usual abandoned house that we had claimed as ours. You know the one. We've all heard stories, of course, and none of us believe them. It was just another place for us to hang out. My parents had gone on vacation with my two younger sisters, leaving me alone with my older sister, who was 19 at the time, getting ready to go off to college. I had asked if she would let me have some friends over. She said I can only have one spend the night. She didn't want too many people here. My friend Jeremy ended up spending the night this evening. We watched movies, went outside and smoked cigarettes. You get the picture. Nothing new or interesting happened until the next day. Jeremy had left to go home around 5 p.m. that evening. It gave me plenty of time that I usually went to bed around 11 or 12 at night. After Jeremy left, my friend Denise asked if she could hang for a bit before me heading off. Well, she did. We were watching TV when I decided to lay down on one of my couches and fall asleep for about an hour or so. I remember waking up with Denise shaking me, saying there was somebody in our backyard looking over our fence, but only seeing their head. After I saw this goatman-like creature outside my house, nothing has been the same for me, nor have any of us witnessed it again that day. I'm currently 25, and still to this day, I get afraid sometimes going outside at night. My name is Jeremy, and my wife's name is Chantel. We're trying to figure out exactly what we saw back in July of 2017, and we're hoping maybe you can help. Where do I start? Well, we were camping at a state park, just outside of Portville, New York. It was a super warm day, and we decided to take a hike through the woods. It would be nice before we headed back home. We parked at the state park, hiked up to a long meadow, and we just sat on the grass, taking in the lush, beautiful scenery for maybe about 45 minutes. Then, we headed back down into a deeper thicket of trees. In these trees, there is a small creek that runs perpendicular and eventually dumps out onto Route 305. This pretty much cuts right past this forest, at least what I've been told anyway. Here's where things get interesting. We made our way back toward 305, following the small creek, maybe by about 200 yards or so, behind some houses. My wife points up ahead and asks, "What's that?" While pointing in between two houses across from us, our attention immediately goes towards a creature standing close by, maybe no more than 5 feet tall. It looked like a goat, except it was standing up on two legs. Really long horns, kind of like a gazelle that you'd see in Africa. You know what I'm talking about, right? Kind of spindly and pointed. It was like that, except it was clearly walking around on two legs, at least from the distance we were at. It didn't seem to notice us, but as we sat and observed it, both my wife and I were like, "What is that? Is that an upright walking goat?" And as we studied it more, my wife studied the lower half better than I. She made note that its legs and lower body was not like that of a goat or any sort of stag animal. It was more human, and we only got a peer at it for maybe less than 10 seconds before it veered off and we couldn't see it anymore. Has anybody else seen anything like this before? Let me know what your thoughts are on the matter. I would love if I can get more detailed information. Please let me know if any of you are free. I will try my best to answer any questions that come to me. I'll try to keep this short and as brief as possible. I love to explore different states and try to go hiking and spelunking as much as I can. And with pre-COVID times, things were much different. Before the pandemic, like the rest of us, I wasn't packed down into a house, stuck, left to my own devices and depressive thoughts. I was out exploring the world, becoming a man, becoming one with nature. diving into places many deemed impossible or dangerous. Hiking 10 miles a day, I was in fantastic shape. But I'll skip the boring backstory on me. I'll get right to my sighting. Now, before I go any further, I can only tell you the general area of Montana that I was in. Because, quite frankly, I believe the cave that I found was an unmarked one. Since usually all the ones that are marked have been found and have actually been made safe by park rangers and such, or so I believe. So, I like to do a lot of off-trail hiking. And what that means is I generally start on a trailhead, and then I just veer off the path. Of course, I keep a compass on me, so I generally know which direction I'm going, and I know where the main roads are. That's always very important to do. Always know how to read a map and to keep a map on you at all times. So, if for whatever reason you happen to lose your compass or you get lost, you know how to get back to safety. I never try and go more than 20 miles outside of the lines of any major highway, road, or trailhead for my own safety. This way, if something does ever happen to me, I'm only roughly 20 miles away from the nearest point of civilization. This keeps me safe and allows me about 2 or 3 days to get back to where I need to go. Okay, now I'm off trailing, and I'm maybe about 9 or 10 miles out at this point. I set up base camp, the night goes fine. I get up the next morning and begin exploring more. Well, I come across a series of caverns, and I don't just mean any caverns, but almost tunnels that interconnect. I decide to take my interest more and explore these further. I've kind of noticed an immediate smell as soon as I get into the tunnel. It smells a little bit stale or like feces, and also just kind of a stink, this pungent body odor kind of smell. This really just damp, really musky odor. It was really foul, but I keep pressing onward. I'm mainly about probably 300 feet in the cave, and I notice there are many other tunnels that connect and also go outside. But I also hear movement coming from further down the cave in another large tunnel after all of them connect into one large tunnel. And I worry because I hope I have not stumbled upon a bear's den. But whatever it is sounds bigger, and I hear it start to move, and I notice one disturbing thing. A bear would be moving around on all fours in a cave, especially if I disturbed it. This was like putt-putt, putt-putt, meaning that something was bipedal in this cave. So I quickly pulled out my maximum flashlight, shined it off in that direction. I couldn't really see anything, but I could hear it coming in my direction. So I started to make my way back slowly towards the entrance, while also keeping my eye behind me. This sound was following me and catching up. Because there were so many winding turns and curves in this tunnel, it's not like I could just shine my flashlight back and get a straight shot at whatever it was. It was trying to catch up to me, I could hear, but it never ran, just walking quicker. And it sounded heavy from each thud of its footprints. And as I rounded the last corner, this thing made its way in full suit. Let me just say before I actually get into describing what I saw, I've never been a believer in UFOs or the paranormal or Bigfoot. Those things always seemed silly, and I had never ever had any sort of weird experience camping, hiking, or being out in nature. So I always just bought those stories as fake, scary ghost stories told around the campfires to scare kids. Little did I know, there's probably actually some truth to them, as horrifying as that is. Standing now fully illuminated in the light was this woolly gray animal. I guess you can call it or say it resembled a bear to an extent, but the head was wrong. It reminded me of a ram or a goat, but more elongated. And it opened its mouth, and it had all these jagged, broken, sharp teeth. It had horns on its head, which is why I bring up the resemblance to a ram or a goat. The horns even coiled and twisted back the same way a ram's does. And its eyes were even similar, except they were more set in the skull. I got the immediate impression this thing was not too happy with me stumbling upon its den, and then it looked fairly upset, that I was even seeing it. I did not take my time to sit there and observe it further. I made a hasty retreat and moved all the way back to my campsite, which was roughly about 2 miles away from this point. After getting back to my campsite, I knew that this thing had not followed me out of that tunnel. I quickly tore down my tent and my campsite and moved going west in the opposite direction of where I had just come. This was in southern Montana. I have no idea what this was or what kind of animal this could have possibly been, but you seem to be a guy who knows a lot about these strange sort of animals. I see you cover things like Dogman and cryptids and Bigfoot. Maybe you could possibly tell me what it is that I encountered. A group of friends and I were at a cabin in Pennsylvania. This was on a Saturday night around 8 p.m. We had been seeing weird stuff all afternoon. So this night, we decided to go investigate. We stupidly left our flashlights in the car. We decided it was getting dark and who needed flashlights, right? But I didn't think having them would do so much good anyway. It's a pretty big field we were walking in that was only half a mile away from the cabin. Part of me thought the moonlight would kind of help guide us. We were sitting there for about 20 minutes or so before actually leaving, just hanging out on the porch. And the hairs on the back of me raise up. I get this horrible feeling like something just isn't right, like I'm being watched by somebody. So naturally, me and my buddy Steve get up to go investigate and ask our friends if they had any feelings or saw anything. They say no, but we all started talking about what we'd seen this past week. And that's when I realized none of my friends had actually seen it. At least what I'm about to tell you. Only myself and Steve. So, we're out there, discussing what this was, when I see it. The figure darting behind some trees all around us. We decide to watch it. So I'm looking around for a bit, and I decide to go get the flashlights from the car. I tell Steve, but he had bigger balls than I did, and wanted to go see what this figure was, without a flashlight or anything. I go to the car, which is maybe a minute away. I get the flashlight, and here he comes, sprinting towards me, white than a sheet. Now, I should include that even though Steve saw it, at least before this, he only saw it in figure form. He never actually saw it up close like now. So he was curious, but I think he thought it was a Bigfoot, and he really wanted to see one up close. He wasn't afraid of Bigfoot, so this made him excited. However, once he started jogging back up to me and was terrified, he explained that this wasn't a Bigfoot, and he would now be haunted for months afterwards. After this, he would constantly wake up with nightmares about what happened. Even after seeing a psychiatrist, he was traumatized. This thing had also kind of chased him too. I'm pretty scared about it, but not like him. He explained to me this was some sort of beast with large horns and large fangs, much like the way a bear would, or as he described it, a saber-toothed tiger, how it has fangs sticking out of its mouth long past its jaws. That's what he described this as. When I asked him for more details, he said it kind of reminded him of a goat, but didn't go into much detail about it, so I really don't know what it is he saw, but whatever it is clearly traumatized him. My guess is maybe it was a demon. My wife and I saw something very similar 3 years ago in southern Iowa, in response to these Goatman sightings you've been writing about. We were camping with family at my brother-in-law's house in Davis County. We heard a loud scream coming from out the tree line. At first, we thought it was maybe some kind of bird. It was so loud. But my wife, who knows birds much better than I do, said it wasn't right. About an hour later, while sitting around the fire, everybody started telling stories about things they've seen in the woods that could simply not be explained. This prompted me to ask if anyone has ever heard of Dogman or anything like that. My mother-in-law then told us her grandfather always said that there was something out in those woods when he pastured his cows alone as a child. He said The only time he was ever frightened is when he saw this hairy man-like creature running across his path one day. They all agree that this thing Dogman has been around in the area for a very long time, and there might even be other things. She also chimed in again and said that her grandfather, too, had seen a large creature, unlike the Dogman. Instead was much bulkier in size and had large horns and resembled that of a goat. Before I could even ask more questions, they started talking more about it. Said that, like Dogman, this thing too was over 7 feet tall, covered in very dark, thick fur, and had glowing eyes. It was in the same vein as Dogman, but different. It seems not to like when people go into its territory, but apparently the kid never felt threatened by it or anything, at least until approached. Everybody seemed to be pretty firm in what they believed in. Why, we didn't talk much more about it though until later on in the evening, when we were getting ready for bed. I was walking inside the camper with my wife and brother-in-law behind me, still talking about what this could be, and I jokingly said, "What if it's actually the Goatman? Just for fun, really." Then, my youngest brother-in-law says very quietly but sternly, "Look." I turned around at the same time he did, and saw something standing off in the distance, maybe 40 feet away from us, right at the base of the tree line. It looked exactly like a hairy man or bear standing up on 2 feet, staring at us. But the head looked exactly like a deer almost, with long horns stretching at the back. At least at 40 feet away and obscured from part of the brush. That's what it looked like. My wife let out a scream, which prompted everybody else to see it too. Then, they all ran for the house. We all stood looking through the window at it, watching it walk over to where the van was parked, looking inside of it before walking back the way it came. What was it looking for? It never made a noise, which is even creepier. We kept saying things like, "What is that thing? Is that a goat man?" But never got too carried away. We didn't want to scare the kids. All of us had trouble sleeping that night, even though none of us really wanted to go outside afterwards. I mean, can you blame us? My brother and I were stacking bales of hay on a beautiful morning in July. It had been very hot, and we wanted to try and get the day's work done early, before it became too unbearable. We still had at least another 3 hours to go, and it was just now 9 a.m. My brother began acting funny, and I didn't exactly find out why until just a few moments after I first sensed it. I looked up from the bale of hay that I was currently stacking, scanning the area until I found what he had been nervously looking over at. This large thing standing atop of a hill, roughly maybe 300 yards away, where we were working. Its face pointed towards us, but it couldn't have seen too much due to the thick shrubbery growing all over. It appeared to have very large chest, legs and arms and head, yet, even though it mostly blended in with its surroundings, one feature on its chest stood out enough to give me some detail about its overall body shape. A small patch of hair surrounding the area on the upper part of its head was darker. I felt my brow furrow as I tried to think of an explanation for what we were seeing. I can think of nothing other than Bigfoot, but this seemed very unlikely, given the fact that this thing was only a few hundred feet away, and the fact that it looked more like a goat than it did an actual ape. Suddenly, it turned to face us and began running downhill after us, the same way an Olympic runner runs. It covered this distance in less than a minute, leaping like some kind of large animal. My mind could not process what was happening fast enough for me to feel fear, despite all my training playing it out in slow motion in my head, a picture taken mid-run. It landed out and let out a terrible roar. I heard my brother's terrified screams as well as the clanging of equipment and sounds of something getting thrown around at high speeds. I sprang to action, grabbing my nearest tool, which had to be a chainsaw laying on top of one stacked bale of hay that was upright, just enough for me to climb onto it. It must have fallen from the truck bed. I just started buzzing away, ready for this thing to come at me. It quickly darted off, sideways into the tree line, now roughly about 80 to 90 yards out, like it knew what was going on. It knew it had been spotted. I quickly put the chainsaw down, grabbed my brother. We needed to jump in the truck and leave now. Just then, I heard this other scream and roar that happened just close by. We were not alone. There was more of them. We needed to get out of here now. It was not safe. My brother kept saying, "But we have bales," and I told him to shut up. I grabbed him by the collar, threw him in the truck, and we flew out of there. We didn't come back till closer to evening time, which doesn't make a lot of sense, right? You know, with the sun setting and all. And it was eerily quiet. We had to get those bales, though. And I would say we probably spent another hour doing it before we just told Grandpa, "Screw it, you can do the rest, Pa. We ain't doing it." After we told him about what happened, I could tell by the expression on his face he too knew what we were talking about. And although he refused to acknowledge it, he understood and ended up finishing up the last 2 hours for us. Crazy. Spring of 2018. I had gone to visit my cousins that lived in a much more rural area in Colorado State. I had a friend in the area as well and was going to be visiting him just outside of this major city. I just got done driving up to my cousin's house, and at the time, I was alone. I parked my car in front of his house, and as soon as I got out, I distinctly heard this growl from behind me. It sounded what I thought was a bear at first, something that's not uncommon for the area. But it didn't really sound like a bear. I heard another growl get let out. Again, this one was deeper. Didn't sound much like a bear. In fact, this one sounded much more angrier. I faced where the sound had come from, which was close enough to make out this figure crouched by a tall fir tree, roughly about 30 yards from me. It looked like a large person, I thought to myself, not fully believing yet what this could have been. I mean, it was kind of dark and covered by the shade of the tree, so I didn't see all the details just yet. But I could tell whoever it was crouched down on one knee and kind of hiding behind the tree. Their head was tilted slightly downwards and a massive frame. There were no yet details I could make yet, other than the fact that it looked exactly like a large man, just covered in something, maybe fur. But as my eyes adjusted more to the shade, I could see that it had long claws, and it was in fact some sort of animal, covered in a thick coat of hair, and the head was most disturbing, resembling that of a farm animal, like a goat or some sort of ram or stag. That's exactly what it looked like. And I saw horns, kind of curling on the back part of its head. This thing goes from a crouching position to standing upright within a second, and immediately, I nearly fall back in panic. This thing was much larger than I expected, and I could tell it wasn't a deer. It looked nothing like a deer, or a bear, but my brain was scrambling to try and put two and two together and trying to figure out, alright, what moves bipedally, but yet what looks like this and has large claws? My brain could turn up with nothing. So I quickly got up, scrambling to my feet, running to the front door, opening it, and telling my cousin, "You need to come see this." But as he comes running out, whatever it was already scrambling off into the darkness. It was enough, though, that he caught the last half of it, so he kind of saw what it was. Enough that he could tell that I saw something not normal. And I guess it spooked him. Having never seen something like this before, we decided to do a bit of research. Maybe we can find out what it was. The only thing that was coming up, though, was like Russian folklore of some kind. Was this the elusive Bigfoot creature? Although I've heard Bigfoots don't look like this one did. I've been in the woods many times in my life, and I have never seen anything that resembled this. I'm not sure if this is a new species or if somebody with a mental illness is trying to pass themselves off as something more than human, maybe in an elaborate Halloween costume. I have never seen anything close to resembling what I've just described to you. This is the first time I've ever told anybody about being so up and close with this creature. It's been almost 3 years now since it happened. Please take my word for it when I say that this is not something you see every day. If any of you get to see such a thing, I would love to know, because I've only ever heard of this stuff happening in the wild state of Colorado, and I've now had at least 4 other people tell me they've seen similar things. Maybe not the exact same thing, but very similar. We're afraid to tell more people about it because, especially in this day and age, with all the conspiracy nonsense floating around, you don't want to get called a nut or someone who's crazy. Anyway, I want to thank you for taking the time to read this, and if you have any questions, please ask. I just want you to know that what we saw was real. It was a living, breathing, flesh and blood animal, even though most people will probably say it was fake since they can't know exactly where and when it happened. But that's fine. I don't expect them to. Thank you again. My story is short, but I feel like I need to tell it. I have family that lives far out in the desert of Arizona. It's not exactly the prettiest state in the world, but they choose to live out there. They love wide open spaces. Well, one night, they were watching a movie and heard strange thumping noises outside. They got up and walked around the house, thinking it was maybe some cattle or something outside in the field next to them. But upon looking outside, they found nothing. That is, until they looked upon the roof and saw an 8-foot-tall black figure standing there, staring down at them. Its arms were long like an ape's, and it had these creepy human-like hands, and this strange head. It was long, flared nostrils. Kind of reminded them of a horse, but noted that it had horns on the back of their head. They also mentioned it having piercing yellow eyes. They completely freaked out by the sight of this, ran back in the house, locking all the doors and windows, even too afraid to call 911. I mean, what would they say? They would probably take it as a prank call. So the creature just stayed on the roof for about another hour or so, I was told, before jumping off and disappearing into the night of the desert. I'll tell you now, they keep a pistol at every door. I can't blame them one bit. No joke. This thing was creepy as hell, especially if you're by yourself. There's no telling what this was. This happened one day when me and my friend were out hiking in the woods in Washington State. I wouldn't go as far as calling us avid outdoorsmen, but we were pretty thoroughly experienced. We both had survival training and knew what we were doing and how to make it in deadly survival situations. That's what makes this story so interesting. While I wouldn't exactly call it a deadly situation, it could have very well escalated into one had we not fled the scene. Who knows exactly what kind of creature was here? Now, the afternoon was beautiful. We were probably 3 miles down the trail when we stopped for a moment to catch our breath and drink some water. It was a little drier out than usual. We were trying to stay hydrated as best we could. After we were done, my friend suggested that we head back to the car, grab some sandwiches. He had just bought a cheap cooler, filled it with food, ice, and good water. While I agreed with him, part of me wanted to stay out there for a few more hours, just really enjoy the sun and open air. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, you know how rare of an occurrence sunshine can be. We both had earbuds wired into each other's phones. We could listen to whatever we wanted as we chatted and listened to music. We didn't really think too much of it when we turned the music off right then and there. However, that would end up playing a crucial role in what happened next. After all, if you're not listening closely to your surroundings, it's not likely that you're going to hear all the warning signs. After we headed back, I took a few steps and froze. Immediately, my friend stopped and asked me what was wrong. I couldn't quite point out exactly what it was that had set off this unusual feeling in my gut, but something definitely was not right. It didn't matter at the point because we had heard this unearthly noise coming from somewhere behind us. It kind of sounded like a goat screaming at the top of its lungs. I could still recall how blood-curdling the sound truly was with each passing moment. It just kept repeating over and over. Since we were fairly far away from the denser brush and trees, we didn't see any goat out in the open. It was too early in the season for hunters to be out there either. I mean, hunting season was still months away. And as far as I knew, goats weren't something that were hunted. And for something to make a sound like that, it had to have been pretty close by. Really confused as to where these sounds were coming from, we decided to look a little further, try to find the source of these noises. We took a few more steps, and the goat screams seemed to stop. My friend looked at me as if he thought I was going crazy, but then we heard them again. This time, though, they sounded like they were coming directly behind us. We turned around and saw nothing. So, we decided to take a couple of steps toward where we heard them coming from. We stopped trying not to alert whatever it was to our presence, listened very closely for another minute or so, and all of a sudden, these goat-like screams turned worse. They got guttural and very human-sounding, like a man and a goat mixed yelling. We both realized there could only be one reason why this thing was doing this. It had to have been the legend of the Goatman. I know that sounds silly, but I have no other explanation for what was making these sounds. This wasn't like it was just some goat screaming. These sounds, it was like coming from a demon. It was like something you'd hear in a horror movie in Hollywood. And that's immediately where both of our minds went to. So we fled. We ran. We got back to the car. The sounds continued the entire time as we were leaving, even getting into the car. And in fact, the noises only grew louder, sounding like they were coming from all directions. The sound is still ringing in my ears today when I think back to it. I told him not to mention this to anybody. I didn't want to get ridiculed, especially coming up with something as ridiculous as the Goatman. How embarrassing. But after finding out that there are online communities that have had real sightings and experiences with things like this and Bigfoot, the things if you brought up in normal conversation, you would get laughed at, mocked, ridiculed. I'm just glad there is somebody like you who will at least listen to my story. All I can say is just be careful out there. You never know what's lurking behind those trees. So, this isn't my story, but actually my father's. One day, I was listening to your channel, and he walks in my room, and he asks, "What's going on?" Asks me, "Who's that? What are you listening to?" So I tell him, "It's your channel, and what you cover." Well, he kind of acted a little strange, and told me that he too had something happen himself. Way back when he was in his 20s, he went on to tell me that for a short time, about 2 years, he worked as a ranch hand for this lovely old couple. After 2 years, he got a career move and moved out of state. But during this time, he did all the usual work that a ranch hand does. Even stayed on the property for some time. You know, helped out with the usual chores, all that. He said the pay was really good, and the couple was very good to him. Amazing hospitality, the pay was well, and they treated him good. It was a great job. But he got offered a really good gig outside the state. So he had to make the decision to further his life and his career, which is why he no longer did it. However, he would tell me some really strange stuff. What happened on their property, especially during the nighttime. He would often tell me about seeing strange things in the sky, weird shapes and objects he just could not explain. I asked him, "Do you mean like UFOs or aliens?" He told me he's not exactly sure. One time, just off the top of his head, and keep in mind there are many, he sees this large triangle or pyramid hovering in the sky. It was probably a mile or so, if he had to guess, away, just sitting there, hovering up in the sky. It was about dusk or so, and he said it was kind of black but had this golden shine to it. He's sure that the elderly couple has seen this stuff before, but they never said a word about it, and they were always gone in the evening, nights, and early morning. Again, this is just one of many occurrences. Oftentimes, he would tell me about seeing small humanoid figures off in the trees, just after night. just these small dark little shadows. And he would always get the impression that he was being watched and began to feel very unsettled deep down in his stomach. Of course, there were others. There were nights where he felt like he was being watched very closely, especially when he was tending the horses. He told me that it always made him the most uncomfortable for whatever reason. He's not sure why I asked him if he ever saw a Bigfoot or a Dogman on the farm. He never did. In fact, I think he kind of swiped at his hand in that motion when I mentioned Bigfoot, like he was saying, no, I've never seen anything like that. But he did go on to tell me one time he found about 6 chickens that were all torn apart. He explained they weren't even eaten. It looked like something had just picked them up and tore them in half. After thoroughly checking the area for coyotes or any lone wolves, he found no tracks, nothing. So he waited at night to see if the assailant would return. And what do you know? This large, burly creature he described on 2 legs like a man, hairy like a bear, but also short, stubbier legs, long claws, long teeth. He would go on to take a couple shots at it. But have you ever seen the Rudolph the Reindeer Christmas special? It's actually the one, I believe, from back in the 1960s. There's a character in it called the Bumble. It's like this big, abominable snowman. Anyway, he brought that up. He said the creature and size was kind of like that. Burly, very woolly and hairy. But the head was more of a sheep. He said it had the same kind of eyes, but very sharp teeth, and these long black horns that jetted back. He said they actually kind of shot upward, the same way a bull's would, where they're rounded and point upward. But of course, this thing kept coming back and kept coming back. It's like it wanted more. It only wanted to kill these chickens, and whatever it can get its hands on. It had already killed a sheep and a goat, several chickens, and even a dog. It never ate them, would just do things like twist the heads off the bodies, or tear them in half, and leave the bodies. He said this thing just enjoyed killing, and every time it showed itself, he would shoot at it several times. Oftentimes, it would happen at least 3 to 4 times a week, always right around midnight to 2 a.m. He's not sure why this was the time it showed up every night, or at least every few nights. He even had to go as far as trying locking up the chicken coop, putting extra fencing around it, and doing whatever he could to try and keep this thing out, hopefully driving it away. He even laid down bear traps, but they didn't work. This thing either disarmed them, showing exuberant amounts of intelligence, or would just go around them altogether, terrifying him. Even one night, when he was tending the horses, he had sat down and fallen asleep with the rifle in his lap. I guess this thing tried to break in. He woke up to the sounds of the horses neighing and going completely crazy. So he jumps up, running over to the stalls where the horses are, shines his flashlight, and sees this hideous creature trying to break into the horse stalls. The horses were already losing it. So he fires a couple of shots at this thing and successfully drove it away. I guess he didn't see it much again after that. But he told me that that wasn't the only weird thing to happen. Weird stuff was constantly going on just like this. But he mentioned that this was the most prominent. Everything else was far and few in between. I guess for him, it didn't really make sense for him to talk about. That's out of his mouth, not mine. At least I got him to tell me his story. And after listening to your content, well, I actually binge watch a lot of your stuff. And I can pinpoint what sort of cryptid this could have been. It makes me wonder, what do you think he saw? It doesn't sound like a Bigfoot. And judging by the way he described it, it wasn't a Dogman. I had asked him if he thought it was a canine, like it all, or resembled a werewolf in any way. He said no. It definitely was not like a wolf or a bear, in any way. It was its own thing. Do you think maybe this could have been a sheep squatch? That's a cryptid not many people talk about. I wonder if this thing could have just been a hybrid sheep humanoid or something. Anyway, I'll let you be the judge. I'll go ahead and email you back if I get any more information out of him. Until then, thank you for all the stories you read. I greatly appreciate it. I often find myself going on night hikes. I love them. They've always been relaxing to me. I'm not the only one who does this, though. A lot of people do. There was a time when it almost got me killed, but I'll get into that in just a minute. I started going on my night hikes right around 7:30, arriving at my usual spot by 8 p.m. The sun had already descended down in the sky. The moon had not yet come up, so there wasn't any light, except for what was given off from the city in the distance. It made for some pretty good scenery while walking through the wood during dark hours like these. I had been going on night hikes for a couple of weeks now. I did it to get a break from the city life. The last week, however, I noticed something following me while I was going on my hike. Every time I would stop and look back, there was nothing there. It made me feel very uneasy and nervous each time this happened. Even though it continued to follow me every night when I stopped for a break, it remained in the shadows and watched from afar. It really scared me, but I stopped spending time in the area where it would follow me. The other hikers told me they experienced the same thing while hiking here at night. I had several friends who enjoyed hiking here, so that's where I heard it from. Unsure of ultimately what was following me, I decided to come back a little earlier. So, this night, I stayed till about 8:30 p.m. I arrived at my usual spot and sat down on a tree stump that was nearby. The sun had already gone down, but the moon hadn't officially begun to really rise up in the sky yet. A few streetlights were lit up in the distance, but there wasn't much light, besides from them and the stars above me. And this is when I noticed something moving towards me through the bushes. It wasn't close enough for me to see what it was, though. Seconds later, it emerges from the shadows and made its way closer to me till it stood about 25 feet away, where I was sitting, on top of an elevated rock near some trees. This thing looked huge, like some mutated cross between a goat and a man. A humanoid with glowing eyes and large horns, huge claws, and it looked pissed. It shimmered in the light of my lantern, but only when I shone the light on it. I just stood there for a second, speechless at what I was seeing. Oh, and by the way, I'm probably a weirdo for bringing a camping lantern with me. But when you're hiking out at night, you need all the LED power you can get. Without warning, it began running right towards me. Unsurprisingly, of course, I took off in the other direction, just as fast as my legs could carry me. I could still hear it crashing through the bush and trees as I ran. But I eventually stopped after a few minutes of running, turning around. It wasn't following me anymore. I couldn't hear it. I could still hear it breathing, though, and watching me through the trees. I couldn't see it, and it really made me nervous. I kept very quiet while trying to stay on the move, not wanting to make a sound. I began to hope that the creature had lost interest, going back into the woods. I eventually made my way out there. I've never seen a Goatman before, nor have I heard of one, but this creature looked very real. And I'm still a little freaked out, to be honest. Apparently, others have had experiences very similar to what I went through. I have heard that Goatmen are actually pretty common here in the woods. A few weeks after my encounter with this goat-like humanoid, I decided to go check out the area again to see if anything was going on there that night. Sure enough, as soon as it got dark outside, every now and then, you could hear these strange moans and groans, deep, raspy guttural sounds and grunting noises coming from somewhere nearby. I didn't want to tell anybody what had happened, so, altogether, I just tried to avoid going on night hikes again. I wasn't able to find any information on these goat-looking creatures, so I just tried to look up Goatman the best I could. Now, what I could find out is that apparently, Goatmen are these humanoids with long horns, sometimes seen at nighttime. There's many urban legends surrounding them, but I had a hard time finding actual accounts of them. Some people say that these are harmless cryptids, but others have experiences of them attacking them. I don't know what I saw for sure, but I can definitely say that it did look goat-like and inhuman. Definitely not a person in a costume. And the description fit what I read about others, having very long horns, claws, glowing eyes, goat legs, and of course hooves. If anybody else has experienced something similar, I'd love to hear it. So this was a few years back when I was in high school. My girlfriend at the time lived in Florida with her mom, and her mom had just turned 49, so she was throwing her a party for them outside. I got the wonderful invitation of coming, so I flew down there to go see my girlfriend. Her mom was loaded, and she loved me, so she would always buy me tickets to come down and spend days at a time with my girlfriend, and I would fly back roughly 4 or 5 days later. Well, this time, something really creepy happened. After flying down for a 5-day weekend, my girlfriend and I had gone to the store and bought her this really nice birthday cake. It was like this hot, vibrant pink. Very 80s glam style, if you know what I mean. The trip itself was wonderful, and we had a beautiful birthday party outside for her. Everybody got down to business. She opened all of her gifts, ate some cake, everything like an event should have been. It was almost perfect. And then, behind the barn in the field behind the house, we saw this creature that had glowing red eyes and horns staring us down for seconds before disappearing. We've never seen anything like it. In fact, it looked like something out of hell. All I can think of was Satan when I saw it. The family, including I, all freaked out because we had never seen this before. It didn't take us long after that discovery for everybody to run in the house and hide. Obviously, I never want to see something like that again. In 1998, I started a new job up in Seattle, Washington. I used to work nights, but on this night, my shift would change to begin working days. This was one of the worst shifts I've ever had. So my manager called me up, asked me if I wanted to switch my shift so I could work with her. She was also a good friend at the time, so I didn't mind helping her out. So this way she'd have an easier time leaving for errands and whatnot, before it got too close to sunset. The sun had just set when we got into our separate vehicles and left the lot heading home. There were 2 different routes I could have taken when I left my home at dusk, heading towards town. The first route took me through a dark forested road with no streetlights or markings, only a faded yellow line. There also was no other cars in sight. It was pretty desolate, no traffic at all. And tonight, I figured this is the best way to go. It was also a Thursday night, so traffic wasn't too bad, and I felt much more comfortable driving through this place at night than the alternative route, which would take me about 15 miles out of the way. Now, the secondary road was also pretty dark, but it pretty much had no markings whatsoever. I mean, you could tell nobody ever traveled down these roads, at least on car or foot, or so it looked. Everything was overgrown, telephone poles kind of bending over, roots tearing up the concrete and asphalt. Just years and years of neglect, a very poorly maintained road. But anyway, I was closely watching my speedometer fluctuate when something popped into my headlights that made me slam on my brakes. The suddenness of braking for this creature standing in the middle of the road caused me to swerve towards the left side. I didn't want to drive over it or hit it. I can only imagine the damage done to my vehicle if I hit this thing. I've probably driven down the same road about 20 times, maybe more, before I ever saw this thing. Basically, it was this upright creature with large pointy ears, but it looked more like a sheep or a goat, and had long horns like Baphomet, if you know what kind of demon I'm talking about, and large fangs sticking out of its mouth. Its arms were massive, and had huge claws draping almost down to its legs. They actually reminded me of that one lady who never cut her fingernails, and they kind of just dangle like long claws. That's what they reminded me of. And its eyes were glowing red, blood red. I'm telling you, this thing looked like a Goatman. It just stood there, staring at me. But in one fluid motion, as this thing appeared, I swerved around it, avoiding it completely. Now, I can't go driving down these roads alone anymore. without looking over my shoulder constantly, or thinking this is going to happen. My friends, family, parents, nobody believes me. They'll think I had a bad dream or just made it up. So I'm just running this out in case somebody else goes along these roads and sees what made me slam on my brakes all those months ago. There are no houses around here for miles. It's pretty rural. So I want to let people know I don't think it's safe to be here. There's also a large population of deer. I don't know if that's maybe a food source or what, but that is something I've had to look out before for at night. Anyway, if you find yourself coming down these dark roads at night, just keep your eyes open. You never know what might appear. I went camping with some friends back near the Ozarks in the east. We were sitting up around a campfire telling stories, and got to hear about one of their family members who had an encounter with something scary. It was dark out, but they said that it felt like it was watching them all night long. A Goatman creature, apparently, that seems to be able to shapeshift between human and animal form. It's also said to live in this area. I can't tell by their genuine fear if they were making it up, or if this was an actual experience. They seemed pretty spooked by what they saw. Well, after enough stories, we got tired and we all crashed out in our separate tents. I, having been the most freaked out, was expecting something to happen. And I was right. In the middle of the night, I heard something just outside of our camp. I assumed at first that maybe it was a large bear or some other animal, and so I gathered up to one side of the tent. Then I hear this loud screeching sound, and I heard it run away. I'm not sure what it was, but I was pretty scared by it. It sounded like it was almost right next to our tents. Of course, because of how dark it was, me or anybody else couldn't see a thing. I tried to stay really quiet though, so whatever it was would go away. But when the thing started running off, you could just hear its heavy breaths. You could feel shivers down your spine. When I say large, it was very large. It scared me. I knew deep down in my core, this wasn't a normal animal I was dealing with. Well, the next morning, we all found huge hoof prints. I mean, just massive size. I've seen cattle footprints, and this was much larger. Maybe we got visited by the Goatman. I mean, I've heard of Bigfoot leaving their feet prints behind, but this wasn't a footprint. This was a massive hoof print. I'm still scared to kind of talk about this. I mean, was this a Goatman? Is that exactly what I heard?
Three years ago now, or so it seems. Maybe 2016. I'm pretty sure I got my year right. I was a junior in high school, and just got out of high school. It was roughly in the evening time, maybe 4 or 5, and so I went off into the woods, goofing around, taking selfies, and just enjoying some fresh air before heading home for the evening. This is in the state of Maryland, and as you know, Maryland isn't really big. But as I'm sitting on this log, trying to take a good selfie, I heard something large approaching me, directly ahead of me. I put my cell phone down, listening, and hearing something approaching more and more. Whatever it was, I could tell was incredibly large. I was curious and stood up, getting ready to guard my ground, thinking it was probably a homeless person, and that maybe I had somehow stumbled upon their little encampment, despite there being any evidence of any homeless camps, tents, or belongings. That's when I began to see this massive black shape appearing more and more throughout the trees. The closer it came, the more details I could see. I clearly realized this was not a person in any way, shape, or form. The closer this thing came, the more I could see this was some sort of demented animal-looking thing. Its eyes were the first thing that drew me in. They were kind of yellow and gold, and had a weird shape to them, and they stared back at me, very strangely, and I could see, through the light that I had, that this thing had horns on its head. Not like a devil, but more like a ram or a goat. It was very strange looking. Because it was so dark, the creature, not the lighting, I couldn't see every little nook and cranny of detail. But I could tell you it was dark, had very dark hair, and a very long face. It kind of just stared at me, watching me from behind a few trees, covered enough by brush that it was somewhat concealed. I've heard of stories of the Maryland Goatman before, but I always just used to think it was tales. Stories spread by kids trying to scare other kids. Or maybe just a good ghost story to get everybody spooked. And there's always folklore and legends of the land that get around. But like I said, I was never a believer. But after this experience, I can firmly say I do believe that the Maryland Goatman exists. And I saw it with my own eyes. This thing was hideous, and it was watching me. I feel like had I stayed there, I could tell it was planning on doing something. What? I don't know. But I noped out of there before I could ever give it a chance to act on it. Luckily, it didn't follow me, as I was pretty close to a road that took me back to my house. I don't go in those woods anymore. For the rest of that year, my senior year and afterwards, I know it's around, and I do not want to give it a chance to meet me firsthand. Last summer, I was with my dad out fishing on a small pond, and as we were coming back up on shore, something charged us. Whatever this something was on 2 legs, covered in gray hair, very long hair, and kind of looked like a goat. I know that sounds weird, but that's what I saw. Luckily, I had my 9mm on me. Not enough to do much damage, but it's better than nothing. I mean, I nearly only brought my pocket knife. I'm glad at the last minute I decided against it. Now, we were coming back on shore, having been out on the pond for probably 4.5 hours at this point. As I was getting out, helping my dad out, I hear some rustling in the bushes, probably about 100 feet away from me, all the way to my left. This puzzled me and my father, because we were in an area where there shouldn't be any large animals coming through. I mean, here in Texas, you get all sorts of stuff, but this kind of commotion was too noisy. It was almost man-like or man-made, as if somebody was intentionally trying to make as much noise as they possibly could. That's when this thing charged out of the brush at my father and I, while my father getting out of the boat and I helping him out. Just out of reaction, I reached in my coat, pulled out my 9mm, fired a couple shots directly at this thing, which, by the way, was much taller than me and my father. I'm 6'2". My dad's 5'9". Don't ask me where I got my height. I think it's from my mom's side of the family. I'm pretty sure I hit this thing point blank. It was probably maybe 50 feet away from me as I fired all 3 shots. That's when it stopped and darted off in a different area of the forest, making an even more horrendous scream than when it came out. Whatever it was acted pissed. I don't know where it came from or why it decided to charge us. For all I know, it could have been sitting there in the woods surrounding the pond, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't even want to think about that. I'm very fortunate that it at least waited until we got back on shore to try and attack. Had we been in the water, and this thing could have jumped onto our boat or tried to capsize us, I don't know if we'd be here telling you the story. The main purpose in me writing you this email isn't necessarily just to tell you my story. I want to try and identify what it is that I saw. It was easily maybe 8 to 9 feet tall, and I don't think it was a Bigfoot or any other cryptid that I've heard you talk about. This thing was something else entirely. It had a very elongated face, kind of had hair that drooped down, large, sharp teeth that protruded from each end of its mouth, kind of like canines, but a little bit different, and had weird red eyes. Not like Hollywood monster glowing eyes. These were a deep red. And I'm trying to sit here and think as I type this, what kind of animal has eyes like this? No, oh well. I guess it escapes me. But the eyes weren't glowing or anything supernatural looking. They looked natural. And its head was shaped more like a stag, if that makes any sense. It also had horns protruding from the very top of its head that reminded me somewhat between a ram and a gazelle. Its lower body was more slender and lankier, where its upper body was more built, wider, and had some rippling muscles on the front part of it. It all happened so fast, so I didn't get to sit there and study it and observe every little bit of this animal. But whatever it was, even though I shot it point blank 3 times, didn't even seem to react to my bullets. It seemed to be startled by the noises of the gunshots more than anything else. I didn't see any blood, so I want to say I got it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I got it. I shot it 3 times, from about 50 feet away, but I saw no blood come from the wound, or drip down, or any sort of blood trail. So I'm not exactly sure how to explain that. That in itself is kind of a supernatural feat. After it took off, bolting off into the woods, I could hear it screaming and screaming as it ran off in a distance. It wasn't a kind of scream, like in pain. It was more like an angry scream. I don't know how to describe it. And the sound of the scream, well, if I could replay it for you, it would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It was something otherworldly. After it ran off, I quickly helped pull my dad out of the boat, as he's older, and him and I nearly just looked at each other, wondering, what in the hell was that thing? But we both agreed we should get our boat back onto the truck and get out of there as fast as we could, in case this thing decided to come back, or worse, bring a couple buddies with him. So we took about 10 minutes, loading the boat back and getting everything we had back in the truck, and we took off out of there, making sure to not leave anything behind that we would need to come retrieve later on. And that would have been a mess. The area in which this whole event occurred was northeastern Texas. I hope this finds you well, and I hope you can help me properly identify exactly what this creature was. This story that I'm about to tell you occurred last year in 2019 on March 5th. I'll never forget it. I was driving outside of Louisville, Kentucky, when I saw this bizarre-looking animal walking on its hind legs across the road, dragging a dead deer. I'm not sure if the deer was already dead, roadkill, or if this thing killed it. But it seemed to pay no mind to me. I came upon it slowly, and even ended up having to halt my vehicle, pressing fully on my brakes as this thing casually strode and went across the road. It paid no attention to try and hurry and rush. It just took its time, dragging this deer. I couldn't help but watch in horror, trying to figure out what exactly I was looking at. Could this have been a person in a Halloween costume? It's not really likely. The area I was in was pretty rural, and virtually 0 communities around where I was. Well, maybe not 0 communities, but houses were pretty spread out. There would be no incentive for anybody to be out here this late at night, dragging a dead deer off into the woods, across the road. It just didn't make any sense. Because it walked so slowly, I got a very good look at it. It was covered in long, gray, strangly hair, had a very elongated face, like that of a horse or maybe a goat, except much, much uglier. It had strange eyes. They were kind of more human-like. It's hard to say, but I can clearly remember its gait and how weird it kind of hobbled around. I didn't see its lower half really as much as I did its upper half, but its posture almost reminded me of the hunchback of Notre Dame. It had a terrible hunch in its back, and I immediately thought this creature might have scoliosis, if that's what it was. But it just had one arm behind it, dragging the deer, and paying no mind to my vehicle, looking directly ahead, and just casually pulling this deer along. As soon as it crossed the road, it disappeared into the forest, and that was that. I sat there for a minute, trying to process and fully digest what it is that I just saw. Clearly, this had to have been an elaborate prank with a $2,000 Halloween costume. There's no way this was real. I continued driving, thinking about what I saw nonstop, and every conclusion I could come to made no sense of why a person would be doing just that. It had to have been something other than a person. An animal. But I've never seen an animal that looked like that. After a short amount of time, I gave up on putting so much mental energy and focus on it, and just contributed to another freaky thing that happened in my life. After discovering the whole scary story thing, and listening to monsters and cryptids, and knowing more now what I do than I did then, I'm almost certain I saw a Goatman.